Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this final session of Deutsches Wirtschaftsforum Digital. In this session, we will talk about technology tackling the world's biggest problems. And I'm really pleased to be joined by Sohn. Yang serves as a corporate president and chief strategy officer at Samsung Electronics. He held numerous senior positions in the semiconductor industry, and he is an active investor in startups across the globe. So, Yang, really pleased to have you here.
Thank you, Max, hosting me. Really appreciate joining this economic forum.
Cool. So let's just jump right in. Yang, I think you are one of the best connected manager when it comes to digital technologies. So I would like to start you, I would like to ask you in the beginning, what do you see as major technology trends on the horizon, and how will these technologies shape business models, but also our economies as a whole?
I think this is a really exciting time as we are carrying the supercomputers in our pocket that are generating tons of data, along with the pervasive sensors everywhere, from home to automobiles to your work, with a connectivity that we never had, that are really reaching out from all locations and spaces, that are creating a platform that are really in a way generating data that are giving us a much better insight than we ever had about our lives. And this data flywheel is generating even bigger opportunities as the data gathers. So I believe all business that we have will disrupted with the transition that we are going through. So I would give a fintech, health tech, insurance, and any industrial 4.0 companies will be going through massive change because we have so much more insights about the trend, the patterns, and opportunities that improve efficiency. In some ways, data is exploding. Now it's exploding to a degree where it doubles every 2 years. So, which means that we are really creating a whole bunch of information that we never had before that can give you information about us. For instance, if you look at genomics, we now know a lot about our genes, our sequencing information, along with some of the information about understandable the diseases, and you can be able to diagnose, being able to anticipate and being able to treat. And these are some examples of simple things, but that are happening across all industry. I'll give you an example of insurance. Insurance is going to change as well. As you know, it's been more driven by your age, where do you live. That determine, the demographic determine your insurance premium. Going forward, it will be more individualized based on your own lifestyle, your own, the education, the experience, and the way you do things. And based on your risk profile, you might have exactly much more precise information about personal insurance. So things are going to change. And obviously, we have to think about privacy of data in balance to making sure these things are in the rights of individuals along with the benefit of the business. And that have to be checked.
Yeah. You've been talking about this massive amounts of data we are accumulating in different industries, right? And then the question arises, how do you actually handle this massive amount of data? And some people argue that you need a new architecture in computing, in semiconductors. And particularly here in Germany, we currently have a debate about quantum computing and what is the potential of quantum computing. So can you give us kind of an impression, what do you think, where are fields where we can use quantum computing for? So what is kind of the purpose and the potential of quantum computing?
Well, I would just say that there are classical computing that we've been living with last 50 years. And that computing has served us really well, in a way, driving our cloud, our mobility, and our internet era. So that compute has a tremendous power and still has a room to go, but it does need to continue to extend and expand capabilities. So there are a lot of the changes that are going on. I will just say there are three things that are really critical in some of the core architecture. One is around what they call heterogeneous compute, which means that traditional compute was done by microprocessor, compute architecture. But now going forward, you will see the GPUs, CPUs, and NPUs, neural network computes, as well as other accelerators coming together. You can be able to give much more what I would call combined compute to give you the kind of things that we need for AI and data applications. So that's more in the area of classical compute. And obviously the storage and network have to be improved as well to deal with the whole bunch of the data that are coming through in the applications. And then there is also other compute requirements that are really challenging us too, particularly when you're trying to do molecular understanding of many atoms in our drug discovery. The compute requirements are still extremely taxing. So understanding what we call large number of linear equation, traditional compute was done through binary compute. So 0 and 1 is how we look at these things. But in quantum compute, you have many quantum bits. So you can actually see many states in between 0 to 1. And therefore, you have a much better chance of running what we call complex linear equations that can solve the problems that are hard to do in classic compute with less power, faster time. Quantum compute is not here yet. I believe it's going to become reality in 5 years, but it will take some time. And it doesn't solve all problems, it'll solve some problems. So you will see different architecture that are coming out, solving different problems that are required to solve going forward.
Thanks, that's really interesting. So let's now turn from technology to world's biggest problems. And I mean, quite obviously, we are currently facing a pandemic, and we are realizing that pandemics are one of the biggest challenges we are facing as mankind. And I would like to ask you, where do you see the potential of technology really helping us to handle the pandemic? And also, what kind of differences do you see in how governments make use of technology to go through this crisis we are currently in?
Well, I think there are 4 general categories that I see as an opportunity to handle this pandemic. Obviously, this is a very difficult time for all of us. This does not happen that often, in a century of, that happens only every century that are hitting us. So technology can help, and technology should be useful in addressing this issue. And this is something that we need to do it together as a community, not just as a scientific group, not just in IT, not just in biology or medicine. So obviously testing is a great example of the kind of things that we can do by being able to run these tests much more concurrently, collaboratively, sharing information. I think these are examples of pooling the data to see whether there is any issues along with the infection management. That's an example of that. The other one I think is about also how do you trace them? Obviously, we have the many tools to look at where the things are through global positioning system, GPS, to Bluetooth, as well as meshing network. We should be able to take a much creative and proactive actions like some of the things like South Korea has done to understand where the tracing is and taking strong actions around that. And then I think that we have to think about prevention. Prevention is about how do we keep space? How do we make sure we optimize given the schedule space we have for your students, for our workforce, so that we don't create the congestion problems that can increase infection. And lastly, it's about creating a vaccine. It's a solution that we need. And I think that there is a lot of collaboration going on between scientists, sharing their information much more openly so that we can be able to just attack this problem as a global community. Just solving in one country is not going to solve this problem because of the nature of this disease. And I believe scientific community is using tremendous IT tools to share and being able to see the progress that are happening. And it can happen in many ways, how you test, also how do you do a trial, and so that we can be able to accelerate traditional vaccine development that takes a really long time, 5 to 10 years, to much shorter time that we need as soon as possible. You
talked about South Korea, and I mean, obviously Samsung is a South Korean company. So can you give us, because that's really interesting to us in Germany, you know, like how come that South Korea handled this crisis quite well, actually, by making use of technology. So can you give us like a more, some kind of concrete examples how South Korea made use of technologies to tackle this crisis?
I don't think it's a rocket science, Max. I think it's more about community and the consumers and the corporations and government all working together for common purpose. So one benefit South Korea had was that it did have a MERS crisis several years ago, and we didn't understand the nature of disease. So when the people came with their infection, they were coming into hospital without any isolation. So it spread like crazy, like wildfire in the hospitals. So we learned a lot about importance of actually isolation, importance of detection, importance of taking actions early, and making sure also having preventive measure. And so keeping the distance and having a mask became part of the work routine. So if you think about Samsung, we've been working without any interruption in our workplace, despite the pandemic, because we understood the issue, we understood the magnitude of this problem. We also knew that if you take the precaution, you can actually contain. And then as soon as when you find that an infection happens, you take a very strong course action so you can be able to minimize the localized issues. So there's no rocket science, but I think it requires discipline. It requires communication. It requires a multidisciplinary community that are working together. So that would be, I think, what South Korea or Taiwan has done. So I hope that all of us take that route until we have the vaccine. And then vaccine should help and should help us to then go back to our normal life. Yeah.
So it's never technology alone. It's always a combination of technology, community, and good governance, I guess.
Absolutely.
So let's turn to the second big crisis, which is obviously the climate crisis. And you've been starting one of the biggest startup competitions for entrepreneurs who try to tackle the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And you're also investing yourself in startups that try to reduce our carbon footprint. So I would like to ask you, like, what is the role for you of engineering, of innovation, of entrepreneurship to drive us towards a more sustainable global economy?
Well, I'm happy to say, actually, in some ways, because of the pandemic, we are not meeting in person, but we are using Zoom technology to do this video. And that's one of the companies I invested personally, because I see, not because it was going to be this successful, but I saw that it can bring carbon footprint. And people like me who make 20 international trips a year could reduce the number of trips. And I think I didn't realize the pandemic is going to make it even more amplified, this issue. But it shows that good business and good, I think the good intended technologies that can reduce carbon footprint can also be a good business. So I'll start with that. But the reason I create this Extreme Tech Challenge organization as the competition for startups to enable to contribute this UN 17 sustainability goal is really about that. I believe entrepreneurship can create ideas that we haven't thought about. Entrepreneurs take risk more than, I believe, the traditional companies. And also the ideas can come from anywhere. So we want to make sure there is no boundary for new ideas globally. So we create this global competition with my friends and colleagues to encourage the entrepreneurs start looking at sustainability issues, whether it's equality issues, access issues, food issues, or issues around education. All these things are fundamental issues. The technology can help. So we want to make sure that all of us mobilize, they're looking at that. I also think that corporation has a responsibility. So how do you connect startups? How do you connect the corporations? And creating a highway between two is an opportunity, might be, that we can all participate. So I'm really happy to say there are a number of corporations that are started to get engaged with startups and trying to look at technologies and entrepreneurs to help them to make it from startup to scale up. Only when you scale up, you can create jobs, you can actually make an impact. When you're just startup, it's an idea, but they cannot survive by itself many times. So we want to create a highway and communication. And also we want to educate the benefit of how technology can contribute for a better world.
Yeah, so we need the measures to scale up, but we also need the actual innovative ideas. And I assume that you are bombarded on a daily basis with kind of new ideas, right? Like technological new ideas in terms of business models. So I would like to ask you, like recently, what were, you know, like ideas you've really been surprised by?
There are several good ideas. We had over 2,400 companies that joined in our competition. And some of the exciting idea came from startup company in Toronto. You know, they are modifying the bacteria to attack the toxic materials that are in plastic so that they can be able to decompose and be able to make it bio-friendly of plastic, for instance. All the way to a school in the Colombia that does not have the online access, but they're creating a mesh network so that they can share their course materials and improving productivity for teachers. Another company would be Rewire, came from Israel, that are helping the migrants to have some kind of banking service for transmitting money and having a digital banking when you don't have actually any account to create a bank account in the new country they are in. So it's helping migrants to be more productive and connected with the financially. Another company that we found in Berlin and Germany was a company that are trying to address the food waste. As you know, over 40% of all the food that are produced is wasted on Earth. So their goal was, how do we create a marketplace between this excess supply and the people that need this food, like NGO communities, and creating a marketplace to optimize supply and demand. And SPRK of Global is a great example of a company that are trying to address that. And they're one of the winners for the agri category for this UN 17 sustainability competition.
Okay, thank you. Yang, these days we talk a lot about polarized societies, right? And when you talk about technology and particularly automation technologies, you could argue that these technologies can aggravate societal polarization, right? Because they leave certain parts of society, well, bluntly disadvantaged. And I would like to ask you, where do you actually see the potential of technology to reskill workers, to augment human beings, rather than driving them out of the production process?
Well, technology is nor good or bad. It's about how we use it, in my view. And as you know, this job concerns been here for several hundred years. I mean, I think when Industrial Revolution started, when engine was coming into the picture, people are already seeing that their job could go away. If you are doing a horse, donkeys, moving things, all of a sudden engine can come and railroad came and it changed their business. So I think the couple of lessons we learned was that we all have to realize technology is here to be used, and we have to be adapt and train and be able to adjust our workforce to be prepared. So that's a very important part of, I think, how we are going to be living with 21st century, for not only about companies, but community as well as government. So it's a very important policy making about how are we going to be ready for 21st digitalized community where everything is going to be used with data driven and technology driven and interface driven. So that's very important, I think, part of things that we cannot ignore. Number two, I believe that our technology will replace some jobs, but also technology create new jobs. New jobs in a way, if you think about data economy, analyzing data, analyzing algorithms, and being able to connect different ecosystems. These are all the jobs that did not exist before. So just like in the 19th century, when oil was discovered, at the time, oil has been around for several thousand years, as you know, but actually it's the 19th century when they realized it can be used as a tools of power, or particularly engine. And that really create whole new applications that we haven't thought about. And then of course, it also create derivatives that are petrol products from nylons to plastics and others that we cannot live without. And this creates a huge new jobs. And I think the same thing will happen, just like that happened in the 19th century. We are in the 21st century where all these new data-driven things will create different type of jobs. The question is not about jobs, it's about how we adjust ourselves to be adjustable to this new society that we have to contribute. I think that also technology can help us to live better. I'll give you another example of a German company that we invested called German Bionics. They are helping you to really support exoskeleton, active generating source of power so that it assists you to lift weights or load down the products. So if you are in warehouse, if you are in airport, carrying those bags that are 30 kilos, 25 kilos every day for 1,000 times can really be a back killer, right? And that's the problem that we all have to live with. But why not having technology to help you so you have the right form and assist you and help you to live with and protect your back? So this is a very simple example, but that's an example of technology can be really positive and complementary tool of our living.
And can you give us an example from Samsung? Like how do you use at Samsung technology to augment workers?
I think that we do a lot of technologies. The number one, we are creating a whole bunch of new mobile phones that are being used and deployed in many of these applications. But even manufacturing our own products, our TV, our mobile phones, we make 1 million phones a day. So when you're thinking about 1 million phones going through assembly line, there are many display and defects you have to manage through human eyes. Can we automate that so that you can be able to reduce the strain the human workers are going through? And that was one of the projects we worked on a few years ago. And we are using camera technology and imaging technology and AI for defect management. So there are so many examples of technologies like that. The other example would be our semiconductor plant. Each of our new semiconductor plants is about $10 billion. It's really expensive, but yet it does not employ a lot of people, but it employs a lot of technology. And to do it, you need to really manage ecosystems that can be able to come together and also automate it so you're not introducing any defects into the manufacturing process. So depend on purpose of what you're trying to do. It has different elements of it, but obviously creating this semiconductor plant, it sounds like a really expensive process, but requires a tremendous optics. Typically come from Zeiss, another German company. Also typically lithography tools are coming from ASML, which is a Dutch company. And then the what I call the processing tool usually come from US companies like Applied Materials and KLA-Tencor. So when you put together, this is how you make very difficult chips that are basically powering all your mobile phones and computers. And so this is a very symbiotic and very tightly connected ecosystem. One cannot do without ecosystem, and we need global collaborations to enable that. I think 5G is going to be also very useful because 5G will give you the real-time information, which in turn, it can be able to make it much more productive than doing it from the delay that are typically connected with the connectivity issues. Particularly in Germany, I think I noticed that as I'm driving, the 3G to 4G transition has been difficult. So a lot of times my Zoom call gets disconnected. And I think with the 5G, you may be able to do all your conference call from Berlin to Munich in one drive without losing any data.
That sounds very helpful. I would like to turn to our last topic, which is about the responsibility of companies. And I mean, Samsung is one of the truly global companies. It's a tech company. And one could argue that tech companies, particularly those that accumulate vast amounts of data, they become as powerful as all companies have been in the early 20th century. So what can we do so that business leaders actually live up to this responsibility?
So I think your observation is right, Max. The problem of today's world is that you have to, the more data we have and the more AI we use, it's going to have an advantage because you have a better insight about your market data, your customer data. So the question is, even if you think about like natural language or search, the more data you have, you're going to be better at this. So how does even startups can be able to compete with the giant platform companies that are already having massive data? And also analyzing data through AI requires a whole bunch of compute. So that costs a lot of money. So there is inherent barrier of entry for many small companies or traditional new companies coming in. So the platform companies will have an advantage just based on sheer data, sheer what I call cloud capabilities and compute capability. So that's something that we have to really think through. But having said that, without having this data, you cannot improve the AI, you cannot improve the platform's capabilities. So it's kind of chicken and egg issues. How do you balance those two? That's the one issue. And then the secondary, I think, issue that we are talking about is the privacy and security of your data. So I think that really important, one have to have a very clear policy around the privacy issues and security issues. Privacy issues, for instance, at Samsung, we have a lot of devices, but we believe all the data coming from the device belongs to consumer, not to Samsung. So it's very important each company have a very clear policy. Also, it probably is very important by government, like what European government has done with GDPR, who the permission-based and where the ownership-based. These things need to be very much clarified, but that's not true for around the world. So this is still in discussion in some places around the world. Korea is very similar to Europe in terms of data ownership and the importance of privacy. In terms of security, that's another issue that we have to manage. Today, we're using encryption technology, but you also notice that clever hackers are breaking through this encryption technology and being able to access to the information. So eventually, we will need to have some kind of confidential data and security where based on the way you use data, the way you talk, the way you consume, they know who you are, so that it's a much safer way of protecting you as a person or entity. And that's we're not there yet, and we have some ways to go to improve. And AI is going to be a very important tool to enable that happen.
Yeah, I mean, we have like in the audience many leaders from industry, but also from government, from civil society. So what do you advise them to actually come up with an encompassing data policy for the 21st century?
Well, this is a journey that requires a active dialogue between the industry and government and community. But I think that only advice that I would say is that start with human rights. What is the rights that we have? And then protect our rights. And I think working on that principle may make it easier rather than what is rights of business. And then we may lose the balance between human rights and business rights.
Okay, I guess that's it for today. Thank you so much, Yang. Always a pleasure talking to you. And to all of you, have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Yep, thanks for hosting me, Max.